So here's a quick outline of our agenda today. I'm not going to go through it in the interest of time, but just to say we're covering various aspects of sensory motor development and assessments. The rest of this information is available in your handouts. And in terms of disclosures, Pearson are publishers of some of the assessments that are mentioned. So obviously to make that clear. So again, this information is provided in your handouts. And learning objectives, again, this was shared with you all beforehand, so I don't really feel you would benefit from reading all these out again, but again, they're available in your handouts should you need to refer to them. And on that note, I am going to pass you over to my colleague, Dr. Susan Nicholson, and we will both going to go off camera. We've been on camera briefly, and we're both going to go off camera and we'll appear back at the end for the Q&A session. So over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Shelley. We will start the session beginning with the development of our sensory systems. It's important to first identify the different sensory systems that we will be discussing today. The first 5 of these are probably the most commonly known sensory systems that all of us learn about, including sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. These last 2, the vestibular and proprioceptive systems, may be lesser known, but they are just as critical for supporting development and function. In the upcoming slides, we will begin by reviewing more about the development of these systems and what they mean for early childhood. Many people don't realize just how early our sensory systems begin development. As you can see from this slide, each sensory system starts with the development of connections and structures not long after conception. However, it may take all the way to birth to be fully intact and functional sensory system. So for infants born prematurely, for example, at 27 weeks gestation, only their auditory and vestibular systems will have fully developed as expected in utero. This means that the rest of the sensory systems will still be developing after birth and outside of the womb. This is one of the reasons you may hear of many neonatal intensive care units, or NICUs, paying special attention to the sensory qualities of the environment, such as minimizing the sounds of machines in the rooms. Let's begin our discussion of the sensory systems first with the visual system. Vision is the sense we are most dependent on for everyday function. When it is intact, we definitely use it. This system provides a continuous information stream during consciousness and works collaboratively with many other sensory systems to support motor skill development and learning. Vision also lays the foundation for all of these noted here. So let me explain a little more on each. First, vision can help us understand the outside world by helping give information to know who and what is around us so that we know when we have to adjust our actions. When we see someone walking toward us, we can then respond to the information by changing our trajectory to avoid bumping into them, or maybe to wave to them if it's a friend. Next, visual skills play an important role in getting young children moving and to keep them moving. Perhaps something an infant sees, such as their parent or a favorite toy, may be the motivation the infant first needs to begin trying to move to get closer to it. Once the toddlers are walking, visual skills such as depth perception are especially important for developing more skilled mobility like walking. Purposeful reach also is supported heavily by the visual system. Early on, it may just be moving arms to hit a mobile that is hanging above them. But as challenges increase, we might also see young children using vision heavily to perform a task before they have mastered the skill. Vision also supports bringing our arms together to work collaboratively at the midline of our bodies. Even infants will start bringing their own hands together or rattle to the midline of their body in order to inspect it more closely. In general, learning is also very dependent on vision. Not only will children watch others to learn how to do things, higher level visual skills like visual perception, visual attention, and visual tracking are important as children begin to assign meaning to things that they see, like shapes, colors, and letters. Next, let's move on to the auditory system. This system first becomes functional in utero and is one of the earliest systems to both start and finish developing. During the development of the auditory system, the vestibular system is also developed within the same time frame. Without going into depth about neuroanatomy, this is because the vestibular system shares structures and spaces with the inner ear, within the inner ear, that are needed for auditory processing. Along with vision, the auditory system helps us respond to our environment and stay safe. When we hear something not in our immediate visual field, we usually will turn to see what we heard. The 4 aspects of sound can be seen here in this diagram. Intensity describes the loudness of sounds. Frequency is the pitch of the sound. Duration is how long the sound was sustained. And localization is the direction from which sounds are coming. Taste and smell, which we'll talk about next, are both commonly referred to as chemical senses and are closely linked. This is because the sensory receptors of these 2 systems actually respond to the molecules in the food we eat in the case of gustation, or in the air we breathe for smell. A good example of this close link is when you have a stuffy nose and can't smell anything. You will find food that normally is very flavorful may actually taste bland. Once your taste receptors have been activated, they can also trigger reflexive responses for eating, such as salivating, swallowing, and even tongue movements to handle a bite of food. Listed here are the 4 basic categories of taste buds. Some people may also include umami, or the savory taste, as another category, after its receptors were only just found back in the early 2000s. One thing to note about taste is that it changes with experience. So for instance, a child may initially refuse a food that later may become a favorite as their tastes evolve. And now into the olfactory system. Since olfactory is a chemical sense, babies can actually start smelling at 28 weeks gestation. This is because smell is not impeded by amniotic fluid, since the odor molecules actually start in a liquid phase in the nasal mucus. Researchers think that this helps with olfactory imprinting of their mother. Smell is unique among the senses since it does not travel to a relay center for processing before reaching the brain. Instead, it is transmitted directly from the nose to the cortex. Babies get some of their earliest impressions about their environment from smell, such as preferring their mother's scent over another person's due to the imprinting we just mentioned. When the other sensory systems start becoming more efficient, their ability to understand the world around them begins to expand. Smell is also closely linked to the limbic system, which is crucial for emotional regulation and memory. We can even use scents to help change our mood, such as using lavender bubble bath for calming. And it's not until about 3 years of age that children can actually tell good smells from bad smells due to the influence of that limbic system. They actually have to learn what a bad smell is from experience. The tactile system is a main channel of sensory input, both prenatally and in infancy. At birth, babies can feel things better than they can see, hear, and taste, so they use touch while the rest of their senses are catching up. The tactile system is critical for activating many of the reflexes that we see in infants. Think about the rooting reflex and how a touch to the cheek helps an infant orient to a source of nutrition. Tactile discrimination, which can be described as the ability to differentiate information using the sense of touch, helps us tell the difference between textures or objects, or even where something is in contact with our skin. Motor skills use tactile information in addition to other sensory input to help coordinate movements. Without it, things like fine motor control can be very challenging. Children use information from the tactile receptors to better understand the physical world. This is why infants often explore toys by mouthing the object instead of just looking at it. Social emotional well-being is also heavily influenced by touch. There is much research on how children deprived of touch are significantly impacted in development, such as children who are in orphanages with low staffing, who only touch the children when necessary. The vestibular system is important in its ability to act as a primary organizer for other sensory inputs. Essentially, this system is what makes it possible for us to move through space and work against gravity in a coordinated movement pattern. Vestibular input is very crucial in regulating our alertness level, which is why rocking chairs are so effective in calming a child before going to sleep. This system also tells us whether we are moving or still, in what direction we're moving, or how quickly we are moving. It also helps us understand whether objects are moving or motionless in relation to our own body in conjunction with the visual system. Proprioception is the awareness of both the position and the movement of the body. Receptors for this system are in the joints, muscle spindles, tendons, and even some in the skin. The information provided includes the direction, velocity, and the effort of the movement. The system also supports the modulation of alertness and arousal level. For instance, swaddling an infant provides some proprioceptive input in addition to the tactile input because of the neutral deep pressure applied in the swaddling process. The proprioceptive system is also critical for developing motor control and planning. For instance, a child who may have difficulty processing this type of sensory information may not be efficient in knowing where their body parts are during motor activities and can often appear clumsy. The system helps answer these questions listed, which in turn allow for more efficient and effective coordination of our movements. So what does all this mean for early childhood? If you look at the pyramid of learning, you can see that early childhood development functions somewhat as a hierarchy. Lower levels of the pyramid typically need to be functioning well to allow for the higher order skills to be achieved and mastered. So after the central nervous system develops, the sensory systems start becoming functional. Then the sensory systems work in conjunction with motor abilities to increase capabilities for simple movement patterns. As the children get older, perceptual motor development really takes off, allowing for more complex tasks to be mastered, and cognitive processes also expand. So by supporting sensory skills early, caregivers and educators can help a child progress through the development toward more complex tasks. So there are many beneficial outcomes of providing sensory supports. These are 3 important benefits. First is understanding the pattern of sensory processing, which we'll go into more detail in the next section. It can really give some insight into what sensory experiences might be influencing the child's behavior or their ability to self-regulate. For infants, this may help caregivers understand why a child is happy, fussy, or slow to warm up. Supporting the sensory preferences of children also may allow them to better engage with caregivers and peers. For instance, children that may appear to get easily overwhelmed in a loud community setting may be more likely to interact successfully with other children when in a quiet room. Understanding sensory processing challenges may also allow young children to better participate in tasks, especially when sensory preferences are respected and task modifications are incorporated. Changes in the physical environment and materials can be supportive of improving performance and engagement in tasks. We also know that there are some conditions which may have a higher incidence of showing sensory differences based on the literature out there. And these first 2, visually impaired and hard of hearing, are somewhat obvious since there's an actual impairment in the sensory system that they're identified by. The rest of these conditions are well documented in research and textbooks, but a reference was provided for those interested in more information. So with that, we're going to start talking about how to address some of the sensory needs, and Shelley's going to take over that part of the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. And thank you everyone for joining us. For any of those of you who joined late, Susan and I are off camera at the moment just to save bandwidth, but we will come back on camera towards the end of the session. And I just have to make one comment. I am seeing the chats coming up with all the different locations that people are based in, which is wonderful to see. I'm based in the UK, incidentally, but I'm broadcasting here from the UK, as my accent might allude. So anyway, on that note, so let's talk a little bit about how we might assess sensory needs. So yes. Oops, I went back one. Let's see if I can go back. There we go. Sorry about that. So I wanted to just talk about when we're assessing sensory needs. There are different models, different approaches. Some are looking for dysfunction. Others are looking for sensory patterns. Some are standardized and some are non-standardized. Some use clinical observations. For this very short section here, I'm going to focus on sensory patterns and relate that to the sensory profile, which is one of our assessments, obviously. But obviously there's other literature out there that talks about sensory processing, but I think there's a lot to be said for how we look at sensory processing and how useful and valuable it is when we're looking at the sensory profile. So the slide you have up in front of you is the World Health Organization's ICF model. And the ICF is the International Classification of Function, Disability and Health. And it's an international standard for framing, describing, recording and measuring function and disability. And I find this a really useful model to refer to. So instead of focusing on a medical diagnosis, the ICF focuses on function and participation resulting from that interaction between health conditions, environmental factors and personal factors. And functioning and disability are very much described as being on a continuum and described in terms of body structures, or as we can see on the left here, body functions and body structures, or body functions and impairments, sorry. And in the middle, we're looking at activities or activity limitations. And on the right, we can see participation or participation restrictions. And at the bottom row, you can see environmental factors and personal factors. So environmental factors can be described as perhaps barriers or facilitators, and they may indicate what perhaps needs to change to support people to achieve their optimum level of functioning. And personal factors might be things such as age, personal interests, etc. There's also a reference on your screen from Sanchez Fiera, and this is quite a useful reference for those of you who might be working in an education setting, which talks about the ICF related to educational support. So that's just on there as a reference for anybody who wants a little bit more information on that. And this next slide, I've just taken the ICF model and just sort of applied it to neurodevelopmental conditions, so which is a bit of a catch-all term, but if we looked at things like body function and structure, that might include things like movement, voice, vision, etc. Activity might be mobility, eating, drinking, dressing. Participation might be playing, riding bikes with friends, computer games. Environmental factors, home environment, social services, educational setting, and personal factors such as age, personal interests, frustration, things like that. So it's important really to note that the ICF isn't limited to health-related conditions. It includes all areas which can be measured and addressed to meet individual goals. So let's look at that a little bit in relation to the sensory profile. Oops, I clicked too fast there. So the sensory profile is a caregiver or teacher questionnaires. It very much focuses on strengths, and it's a tool which helps us provide insight for caregivers and professionals of different contexts and how they might impact, or how the interaction between sensory processing and contextual factors and environmental factors. So it very much relates to that ICF model in how it's used. So just to sort of give you a little bit more information about it, I keep clicking twice, I apologize for that. So this is Dunn's sensory processing framework, and Dr. Winnie Dunn developed this with her original sensory profile and developed it further for the sensory profile too. And just to orientate you to this slide a little bit, it basically reflects an interplay between two core concepts. So we've got a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. So the vertical axis is a neurological threshold continuum. And this indicates the points, or it talks about the points at which the nervous system has enough information to act. So at a low threshold, there's very little information to act. Very little information is required to activate the nervous system, whereas at a high threshold, lots of input is required to activate the nervous system. So at a low threshold, you're very quick to notice sensory stimuli. At a high threshold, you're very much slower to notice sensory stimuli. On the horizontal axis, you will see is the self-regulation continuum. On the left, there is passive, and on the right is active. And this self-regulation continuum refers to how people respond to activation. So as I said, on the left is passive, so they allow sensory experiences to happen and then react. And on the right is active, so they engage in behaviors to actually control or manage the sensory input. And this results in four basic patterns. As you can see, we have registration or bystander, we have seeking or seeker, we have sensitivity or sender, and we have avoiding or avoider. And all people, we're all influenced by each of these patterns, but some people demonstrate a dominant pattern. So, for example, some people might miss more sensory inputs more often than others. And some people might notice and retreat from sensory information more often than others. So, you know, this is just a way to sort of think about how we interact with our environments and how it can sort of impact on our sensory processing and how we kind of accommodate it in our everyday lives. And the important thing really is to notice that this is not unique to diagnostic groups. What we're really interested in is how individuals respond and what it means for an individual in different environments. So we'll go on to the next slide. There's just some examples here of how this might sort of be depicted, or these are items from the actual sensory profile. So an example of an individual who is a bystander or a registration who misses information, they might need help to find objects that are more obvious to others. For seeking, they might touch people or objects more often to the point of annoying others. For avoiding, they might be sensitive to criticism or react strongly to unexpected noises. And for sensitivity, they might limit themselves to certain food textures. You can read all those on the screen and you can see more information of those on your handouts, but it's just to give you a practical example of what those sort of different patterns may look like. So the important thing here is that, as I've said already, is that all people are influenced by sensory processing patterns, and some may demonstrate a dominant pattern. Really, the important thing here, and this is highlighted on the screen, and I think this is a really important point from Dr. Dunn, is that, you know, we're all influenced by these patterns, but when we're looking to plan interventions and support, we only need to do that after noticing that perhaps a particular pattern of sensory processing interferes with something the child or the parent or the caregiver or teacher want or need the child to do. You know, if it's not impacting, then we don't necessarily need to do anything about it. So we need to look at that interaction of the environmental context, the participation needs, and bring all those things together. And that's what the sensory profile does. It helps you, provides insights about the child's natural ways of responding rather than looking at a way of trying to find something that needs fixing. And it helps you think about how the sensory processing patterns might guide discussion about when things perhaps work well or when things are challenging. And you can link the child's sensory processing patterns to those daily events so that parents and teachers begin to understand, and they can negotiate changes that might support a child more effectively without actually considering that something is wrong. So it enables caregivers, educators to sort of successfully make adjustments to support the child, and eventually leading the child, helping the child to become their own advocate if they can understand what their needs are and how the environmental factors might impact those needs. So when supporting individuals with sensory processing needs, there are many ways to support a young child with sensory processing needs, and some are listed on this slide here. Often there is a focus on what the student needs to work on to participate better, but really areas of improvement do not necessarily mean that we need to fix the child. It may be that a broader approach of closing the gap between abilities and what is expected is the answer. So building on strengths, respecting preferences, understanding routines and things like that are the really good ways of supporting sensory needs. And I could talk about this a lot more, but in the interest of just sharing information with you today, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So, clicked twice again, 3 times even. Okay. So here are a couple of useful resources that I just wanted to share as sort of takeaways here. There's a really useful article from 2013, which is in your handouts, and the references here. This is a really good practical article which talks about meeting the sensory needs of young children. And also for those of you who do have the sensory profile, there's 2 appendices which people aren't always aware of. Appendix B, which has some really good, useful intervention strategies by quadrant and by sensory area. And there's some really, really good practical ideas in there. I'm going to just share a couple with you in the next couple of slides. And then Appendix D, which is a tool for helping, it sort of helps provide a structure for documenting the sensory characteristics of the context within which a child must operate. So by examining both the naturally occurring sensory events and how these events affect a child's participation, you can begin to get a sense about what adaptations might be possible. So that's another, for those of you who have the sensory profile, that's another useful resource just to sort of direct you to, just to help you sort of structure those interventions and supports. So just to talk about some of the common sensory strategies. So some ideas just to share here with you. So Susan talked about some of these areas: movement, visual, auditory, tactile, and other areas as well. So so common sensory strategies to support movement might be things like using movement breaks or yoga, using multisensory learning techniques, visual, changing lighting, reducing visual stimuli. I'm not going to read through everything on the slide, but basically the slide is providing an overview of the type of sensory strategies which might be applied for a young child to support that function and participation. And by changing the intensity, so some of the ideas that are listed here, by changing the intensity, the complexity, or even the quality of one or more sensory elements in the physical environment, can actually help that child participate. And you can use assessment to help inform the supports you need. So the sensory profile results, for example, may indicate a need to increase or decrease that intensity of input to help support participation. And the next couple of slides, I'm just going to highlight a couple of those ways or ideas. So this slide here just shows some intervention examples for someone who might be more than others avoiding. So here the goal being to decrease sensory experiences in daily activities. So, and this is taken from that Appendix B of the Sensory Profile Manual. So if visual is an issue and you need to decrease sensory experiences for visual, we might do things like lower lighting levels. Auditory might diminish background noise. We might warm baby wipes for touch. We might take the stairs instead of escalators. You don't need me to read through all these, but it sort of gives you an idea of the sort of things that we can do. And these can sort of help just support those sensory needs in a very practical way. And just to give you another example of the other sort of end of the spectrum, so this is a less than others avoiding, and the goal here being to organize sensory experiences in daily activities. So so these children tend to detect more input than is manageable, yet they don't always respond, and they don't always retreat, or perhaps they do, retreat when they're overwhelmed. So they require help to manage and organize this. So activities which are fast paced or require filtering are likely to be more challenging. So again, thinking about that filtering, reducing decorations in the room, perhaps using a fan to create white noise, maybe designing games with patterns of movement expected. Those sort of examples can help you sort of organize that sensory input, so the child or the individual is more prepared for what is expected or what's going to happen, and are more able to manage and cope with it. So that's a really quick sort of overview of some of the sensory assessment and sort of sensory ideas. I'm going to pass you on to Susan now, who's going to talk about motor development. So over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Shelley. We're definitely going to get into a lot more detail on motor development before passing it back to Shelley again. So you can think about motor development as an adaptive change toward competence or ability. So an adaptive change is a result of a transactional relationship between the individual and the environment to complete an actual task. These three ultimately determine the level of demand. So if the individual skills are high and the environment is conducive to the task, then the level of demand would be low. However, if the individual skills are low or the environment is challenging for the task, then the demand level will increase. Achieving motor competence can be thought about as being more about being effective with the motor activity than actually mastering the task or skill. So when we think about motor development, dynamic systems theory has really helped explain why development may be different between individuals. This theory accepts that there are internal and external factors, some of which are listed here, which can contribute to the development of motor competencies. This is especially true for early childhood. For instance, a child who has the strength and coordination needed to take their first steps may achieve the milestone faster if the family makes practicing walking a little bit every day a priority in their daily routines. In this example of walking, those first steps can be a difficult skill of walking. Sorry, the child may have the basic skill, but there's still much more work to do. So after that skill is acquired, so taking those first steps, the child must then refine it to develop mature performance. So our example, now that child is able to walk 10 feet before they're sitting down or being caught by their parent. But mastery of motor skills requires the skills that they're learning to put them together and combine to produce more efficient and effective movement patterns. So walking, going from that 10 feet, which eventually include also being able to start and stop, to slow down, to speed up, change directions, and so on before mastery would be considered. So one thing that anyone working with young children knows is that the only thing predictable about young children is that they can be unpredictable. Although ecologically similar across cultures, there are some differences when you think about motor development. So you may find that cultural variations are present in some of the early skills, especially like walking and rolling. A great example of that is in the US, there was a push some years ago to encourage back sleeping to prevent sudden infant death syndrome. That push actually probably contributed to a delay in when rolling was occurring with the infants. So now parents are prompted to be ensuring tummy time was occurring regularly in order to sort of make up for that change in the culture. So motor skills also consistently develop and head into progression. For example, head control comes before trunk control that is needed for sitting, which in turn then comes before overall postural control, which is needed for standing. Additionally, motor development progresses from close to the body to farther away from the body. So if you think about early movement, babies first explore their own hands, bringing them to their mouth or toys to their central line. As motor control and strength continue to develop and strengthen, only then will you start seeing them reaching away from their body for toys and objects. You will also see progression from less controlled or reflexive movement patterns to more purposeful movement. This is the difference from a baby swatting at a mobile hanging above them to actually being able to grab it. Anti-gravity flexion follows anti-gravity extension. For example, during the tummy time that we talked about, when infants are starting to lift their head using neck extension and arm extension, before they're able to really tuck in their chin, like when they're getting pulled to sit. So you see that head lag when those young infants are pulled into a sitting position with help. Developmental milestones allow for some predictability as well. Although we already discussed, there are some other influences that impact the actual acquisition of developmental skills for each individual child. For this reason, each child may go through a different order of developmental milestones. For instance, my niece decided that walking at 9 months of age was a great idea and decided later that crawling happened to be also a good way to get around. So for the purposes of this webinar, given those individual differences that kids go through in development, we're going to focus on the patterns of motor development instead of specifying age approximations for each of these developmental milestones or things we're talking about. But we do understand that new professionals might benefit from accessing developmental norms as a way of starting to understand and structure those patterns of development. We still wanted to share some of the resources from national organizations and some of the tests that we are discussing in this webinar. Although children will go through milestones at their own pace, it's also key to remember that special populations may be significantly delayed in achieving those milestones, even basic movement abilities, but they tend to still go through the milestones as you would expect, just on their own time frames. So these are a few resources for people wanting more information, including a couple from our test manuals, including the Beery VMI has some great resources, as well as the Peabody Developmental Motor Scales, or PDMS2. They have a motor development chart that can be really useful in kind of understanding expected progressions. So as we discussed in the pyramid of learning earlier, reflexive movements are near the bottom of that pyramid. Reflexes have strong adaptive value and really have two main functions initially. They both relate to survival. One is to protect, and the other is to get nutrition. Later, these reflexes also start laying foundations for functional movement patterns. And we'll talk more about those reflexes as we get into fine and gross motor skills. So what reflexively started as a way to move a hand away from, say, an unknown stimuli, eventually evolves into bending the arm to bring a toy to the mouth. So we're going from something reflexive to something that's voluntary or purposeful. So in general, most reflexes disappear or integrate during the first 6 months after birth, but all of these reflexes that we're talking about today should be disappearing by the time that children are about 12 months. So we often see that volitional control, or that purposeful action, is achieved as the reflexes begin disappearing. So when we think about the stages of motor development, it also helps to have some predictable stages for that. The first stage of this would be mobility, and the reflexes help just get the baby moving, right? Those reflexes and reflexive actions help get the legs kicking, the arms swinging, heads turning, and bodies starting to flip over. And with time, these movements get more and more controlled. So the next stage we would expect is stability. And this is when the infants are able to start holding positions. So this is when you start seeing them propping up on elbows during tummy time, or being able to sit up. So that stability allows for some increase in function and participation. Controlled mobility is the next stage, and that's when a child is starting to do things like changing positions, or creeping, or crawling, or maybe cruising furniture. But skill is really when you think of having the skill mastered. So this is when they're able to do something seamlessly with transitions between positions and move efficiently while also engaging in tasks. So it's definitely a skill that you would see as they age. So now that we've kind of gone through a broad overview of motor development, we want to more specifically target gross motor development. So since we're focusing on patterns instead of ages, we are going to give you kind of an idea of some of the reflexes that we would expect to see for gross motor skill development. So these reflexes on the slide commonly appear in pediatric assessment tools like the Bailey-4 or the PDMS2 that we mentioned earlier, and many developmental tests that are appropriate for children under a year of age. Since, again, all these reflexes are expected to have disappeared by a year of age in typically developing populations. So we're going to talk a little bit more about reflexes again when we get into the fine motor section. So when you think about developing gross motor skills, after that first year, that relies a lot on moving and movement coming from reflexive movements and that transition into purposeful movement. We also see a general trend in gross motor development that's depicted here in the stair step. Typically, you expect children to develop skills in order from left to right, and most of this progression will have been achieved well before a typically developing child is about 2 years of age. A couple of the terms may not be familiar to some, so I want to review those. Control and prone, or being on the tummy, usually is observed first. As we mentioned earlier, extension, often the anti-gravity extension develops first. So you can think of this as babies really pushing up off the floor as they're motivated to get out of tummy time. Control while on their back, or supine, may take a little more time as they gain strength for arm control against gravity to really swipe and reach with more purpose and intention. Another term that may be less familiar to some is quadruped, which is the position on hands and knees. These are some of the items that you might see in developmental assessments, such as the PDMS and Bailey-4 and so on. Again, this is kind of for the younger kids. You would start seeing them working on some of these skills. This is where you see a lot of those stability skills mentioned before, such as sitting and moving, starting to move into controlled mobility skills of standing and squatting. As the children get older, we also start seeing advancing gross motor skills. So for typical performance assessments, we might see some of these items like walking and running and jumping over items and standing on one foot. And these are items that measure these gross motor skills and tests like the Peabody again, and the Brunitz-Otskoretsky test of motor position, or BOT, as well as the Bailey-4 and the movement ABC. So now we are moving from controlled mobility, moving well into that skilled age, because you can imagine like skipping is a very hard skill for young kids to coordinate. So that was a very brief overview of gross motor. So we want to get a little bit into fine motor as well. And again, we have some reflexes that help contribute to the development of those fine motor and visual motor skills. So these upper extremity and hand reflexes lay the foundation for movements. And again, you'll see these as items often on developmental tests like the Bailey and PDMS too. Just like in gross motor development, fine motor and visual motor development also has trends or patterns that you see in development, even though each individual child might be a little bit unique in the progression. But we're going to still continue to talk about progressions. So for reaching, this is one of the first upper extremity actions you may start to see in young kids. Initially, newborns will move arms independently from each other, but it progresses into moving those arms together as they start gaining some control and some awareness of their body. As infants show increasing visual regard for the things around them, they will also begin to start doing attempts to interact with those things that they see. The more controlled the infant develops, the more they're able to reach for a toy and actually successfully interact with it. Reaching is closely related to gross motor development. And the reason why it's so linked to gross motor development is because that postural stability of their trunk is used to give the stability so they can reach outside of their immediate range. There are also some progressions with grasping patterns. So once that infant is able to reach for objects, they start wanting to obtain or actually hold the object. So initially, this is also reflexive. You think about the palmar grasp when you put a finger in a baby's palm and they hold on to it. But once this reflex is integrated, then you start seeing voluntary grasp emerge. These patterns often seen include proximal to distal. So proximal being closer to the body will happen first, and then distal, which is farther from the body, will happen next. Another pattern is that the whole hand will go to fingertips. So I think self-feeding is a great skill to watch this progression. If you think about a child first starting to pick up cereal puffs for a meal, you will think of them grasping a whole pile of them in their fists and then like trying to open that fist and shove it into their mouth. But they quickly move into using their fingers, so they have more success getting that cereal into their mouth. Eventually, as tasks get much more skilled and they need to have more control, you'll see them start using the tips of their fingers or their finger pads in order to manage the tiny items. So this is another progression expected that you would see, but again, every kid is a little unique. From the grasp that start, the ulnar-palmar grasp is using the ulnar or the pinky side of the hand, which you think about those kids grabbing food off their tray for eating. That is the side of the hand that they're usually sliding against the table in order to gather those cereal puffs. The end of this progression is the tip-to-tip pinch that is needed for more advanced skills. So all of these types of pinches and grasps all start to emerge in the first year but they really will continue to refine as new tasks require more control well into young childhood. I think it's also important to discuss grasping pattern progression for holding writing tools. On this slide, you'll see a typical stages of grasping a crayon or pencil. So top down is kind of the progression you would expect. We start seeing the earliest of these at about 12 to 18 months, which is that pronated grasp, which is thumb down toward the paper, comes at about 2 to 3 years. And then you may not see that more mature quadrupod or tripod grasp, which are the 4 3-finger grasp respectively, until a child is actually 3 to 4 years of age. But again, kids are unique. Release is important because once the infants learn how to grab an object, then they need to learn how to let go of the object too. So release accidentally might start as early as 4 to 6 months, but then the more controlled or graded precise releases won't be seen until the child is typically older than about a year. So it does take some time for them to really coordinate releases in a way that's functional. Bilateral coordination is another developmental sequence of the upper extremities that begins developing in the first year, but continues well beyond. So when you look at these 4 kind of stages, stabilizing is that first one. It's when the infant begins to use one hand to hold an object still so the other hand can interact with it. And that's often seen at about 7 months of age. An early example of this, you might see a baby holding their bottle with one hand and patting it with the other while drinking. Coordinated movements are when a child can do a task that requires both the hands to work together. So symmetrical would be when both arms are doing the same thing, like clapping or reaching their arms up in the air to indicate they wanted to be picked up. Asymmetrical would be when the arms are doing 2 different things, but in a coordinated way. So maybe this is holding a bucket with one hand and putting blocks into it with the other. And then finally, you have carrying skills, which typically develop only after a child is walking, because they're using 2 hands to carry items, which is a little challenging when they're still crawling. So what does all this mean in motor skills for child development for those young kids? So outcomes of supporting motor needs often fall into these 4 areas. By supporting motor needs, caregivers and educators can really help get children stronger, which can then lead to increased participation in activities with others and more independence and mobility and self-care skills. So in addition, increasing access, whether through directly targeting motor skill development or by modifying the task or environment, can also have a great impact and allow increased independence and participation. So on this next slide, I usually think, when I think about infants and young children, I usually think about this way. First, they learn to move, and then they move to learn. So if you think about infants, they start just trying to figure out how their bodies work and how those bodies move, and then how to get around using their bodies. But then once they start getting to move around, then it allows them to start move so they can learn, right? So initially the learning is really about function of their bodies, but then it's letting them explore their environment. So as they move to learn, they might be rolling over to get a favorite toy or to explore an area of the room. Motor skills also are dependent on brain development. So the more connections we have and the stronger those connections are, the better our motor coordination can become. And like sensory, we talked about earlier, deprivation of motor experiences from neglect or lack of appropriate stimulation during critical periods of growth can significantly delay motor development. Movement and cognition also develop together, as many professions learn when taking child development courses, and they first hear about Piaget's sensory motor stage, which runs from about birth to 2 years of age. And also research is also finding that motor activity can influence future and current academic performance. So studies have found that physical activity can actually improve and enhance brain function, energy levels, self-esteem, and engagement. So lots of benefits to let them move. These populations on this slide are likely to be at risk for delays in motor development. With prematurity, there this is often accounted for in many of our developmental assessments, because you'll see instructions to examiners to use an adjusted age instead of a chronological age for that first year or two, depending on the assessment. Additionally, neurological conditions, because of the central nervous system involvement, also predictably will have some motor differences. And the rest of these conditions, there are many references beyond the ones listed on the slide that support that these are areas that we might expect to see motor differences in the children that we work with. These are, again, just some resources to those interested in learning more, but there's a wealth of information in the literature and textbooks on all of this. And with that, I'll be passing you back to Shelley for talking about assessing motor needs.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. Okay, so let's talk about assessment. So I've just brought this slide up again. This was, I showed this earlier. This is the ICF model again. I guess it does relate to motor development and motor assessment as much as it relates to sensory. So I want to talk about how we might use this to support motor needs. So there we go. So as an OT, we generally use the terms top down and bottom up when we're looking at assessments. So, and ideally we need an interplay between both types of assessments. So the bottom up approach can help us identify the physical or perhaps the cognitive area of need, and can be used to plan interventions, to monitor progress in these areas. Whereas the top down approach captures the functional needs or the impact or change to these over time. And these are just as important to capture and to use to demonstrate need or change over time. Oops, I keep doing that too. Right. So in terms of functional skills, here the focus is linked more to the activities and the participation levels of the ICF. And these tend to be to use more sort of functional measures due to the very nature of context and environment. And these tools can be helpful to establish the different environments which may be challenging, or the levels of supports required for a child to participate and thrive in an environment. And I'll give some examples of these in one of the next slides coming up. In terms of performance skills assessments, these tend to focus on the body structure and the functional, the impairments level of the ICF. And these are really useful for providing a structure to allow us to compare developmental norms, perhaps, or to identify areas for intervention and supports. And they tend to focus on the performance area. So these sort of tools are often standardized, and they can sometimes be a criteria for determining eligibility for services. And again, I'll give some examples of these on one of the slides coming up. And really, we generally use a combination of tools. Some tools are good for screening, so perhaps some assessments in healthcare or education setting might be a screening tool to identify children who need further assessment. Some are very good for gathering information about context and environment and the potential impacts. And some tools actually embed this into the assessment. So sometimes you can capture this information as separately as part of an assessment. Some assessments have built-in progress monitoring, which I'll provide some examples of, and some are excellent resources for intervention planning, which again, I'll provide some examples of. Some non-motor assessments might include adaptation options to accommodate motor needs. For example, those of you who might use the WISC-5 integrated, that provides an adapted and varied versions of the WISC-5 subtests to help more clearly explain WISC-5 performance and assess children with special needs, including motor difficulties. And some are very much focused on a comprehensive assessment. In this slide here, I'm not going to talk through this one, but it's just, I wanted to include it just because it's in your handouts, just to sort of, it covers all those different aspects, top down, bottom up, performance-based, fine and gross motor, and comprehensive, etc. So that's just there for you to look back at in time. So as mentioned previously, ideally we need a combination of normative comparisons and functional implications to help determine accommodations and support. So using a strength-based approach means having a focus on an individual's strengths to foster participation during daily routines. And this is very much a shift from thinking about how an individual can fit in to thinking about ways an individual can participate successfully. So it's a shift away from a deficit-based approach. And this really does align with the World Health Organization ICF model, and can help promote self-advocacy and self-determination. And a strengths-based approach very much focuses on closing the gap between abilities and expectations, with the goal really ultimately being to create a better fit between the person's level of functioning and the demands of the task and the environment. So I'm conscious of time. We've got 3 minutes, but I might go over by a couple of minutes for those of you who have time to stay on for an extra couple of minutes. So this slide here just talks about assessment results. So I just wanted to give some practical examples about how we might use assessment results to make normative comparisons. So this is from the Bailey-4, and the profile here is useful to identify individual strengths and potential areas of needs. So here we can see on this profile, if you can see it, cognitive and receptive language are very much a strength. There's some moderate difficulties with expressive language and gross motor skills, but there's some significant difficulties with fine motor, as we can see on this slide. So just taking that to the next level on the next slide, again, this is from the Bailey. We're looking at the scores in a little bit more detail. And here, one thing I'm really interested to know is whether there is actually a significant difference between the fine motor and the gross motor subtests, given that both scores are relatively low. We can see on the motor, the fine motor is 3 and the gross motor is 6. So if we go on to the next slide, we can see here is some assessments, again, such as the Bailey, give us discrepancy comparisons. And this slide shows whether there is a significant difference between the composites and the subtest based on the pattern of scores that we're seeing. So here we can see that there's no significant difference between the communication subtests, between the receptive and expressive language. Even though expressive language is slightly lower, the discrepancy is not that unusual. However, when we look at motor, we can see here that there is a significant difference between all areas, and that there's a difference between fine motor and gross motor. So this indicates that there's possibly a strength there in the gross motor, but fine motor is definitely a potential area of need or support. So we can see that because it's very much a significant difference between those two areas. So it's good to help us tease out and understand the level of differences. Another way of identifying areas of intervention is highlighted in this report. And this is an item map which places the items along a functional continuum. So we can see here on the bottom, this is for basic movement and transfer. So on the bottom, the most basic item is on the belly, turns head to both sides. And if we go up to the top, it's getting on and off an adult sized toilet. So the item map, as I said, places items along a functional continuum, allowing clinicians to see what other items have similar levels of difficulty. The red boxes we can see here indicate response option chosen, and the grey shaded area around the vertical line depicts the scaled score and indicates where we may typically see this child's response as being. So what we can see here is on the right area are strengths. These are where the child's achieving sort of outside where they typically be expect the child to be able to perform. And on the left, we see the areas that are areas of need, and they might be areas that we choose to focus for intervention and supports and accommodations. So it's just to sort of highlight some of those different options. If I just go on to this slide here, another option to track child's growth over time is looking at growth scale values. So a growth scale value is basically it's derived from the raw score, and it's a good alternative to age equivalence. And again, this is an example from the Bailey. So we can see here, if we look at the fine motor and gross motor, so on the left-hand side, we'll see FM1, FM2, and GM1 and GM2. We can see that you can see assessment 1 and assessment 2, and you can see on the fine motor, there might be a slight change in the scaled score over time. Or there might not be a change in the scale score over time, but we can see a change in the growth scale value over time. So we can use that to show that that perhaps compared to their peers, they're not, their standardized scores aren't changing, but actually their growth scale values are changing. So you can use that as an option to demonstrate change over time. And on the right here, we can see whether or not the change that we're seeing is actually significant. Are we seeing a significant level of change? So here on the fine motor, we can see the fine motor growth scale value went from 524 to 534, and that was a significant change over time. So just on this one, again, this is just taken from the PDCAT, which uses a scaled score to track progress. And so this is another way. It's very much like a growth scale value. We have a scaled score of 53 here. We can use this to do a repeated assessment and look at change over time, again, with this. So it's very similar to sort of the last slide that I talked through. And then just talking about some common motor strategies. So I think on the screen here, you can see that what we really want to look at when we're looking at motor strategies is looking at things like environmental modifications, activities of daily living, and inclusion are really, really key areas to focus on. So just like I did with the sensory, I've got to take about 30 more seconds here, and then I think we'll be done. With the sensory, if we look at, as I did with the sensory piece, we're looking at the motor piece here and looking at some intervention examples. So this is an example of a child who uses a walker to assist with mobility and has a wheelchair. And the goal here is being to increase participation in preschool activities in the Head Start program. So if we look at those environmental modifications, the inclusivity, the embedding the strength or the independence goals into daily routines, we can see some options that help to support that individual child, such as classroom organisation, such as giving specific jobs to students within the classroom and to that individual child, and then looking at embedding activities or strategies into things that the child's doing, such as standing endurance during play and social time. So there's a lot of things that we can do here, just general things to support that child in their everyday tasks. And just to move on to another strategy, this is a child with autism, and the goal here is to increase opportunities for physical activity to support self-regulation and development. So in here at school, we might do things like assign classroom jobs that practice fine motor skills, such as sorting small math manipulatives into containers. We might look at structured motor games. We might look at home things, areas of interest for the child, such as this particular child had an interest in karate. So a parent enrolled them into a karate program after they'd watched a cartoon on it. So we're looking at opportunities. Another one might be doing things like Pokemon Go to actually use it as a strategy to get a child out and about, because that's something that is of interest to that particular child. So these are some very quick ideas, and you've got these in your handouts as well, but just to give you an idea of where you can go for some supports and strategies. And on that note, I know that we've gone over. I'm just going to take my camera off and start my video. I don't think we have time for questions, unfortunately, but we will try and get back to people who had individual questions posted that we weren't able to respond to. And just to say thank you to everybody for hanging on that extra 5 minutes. And I'm just going to pass you over to Sherry to close us out. I don't know if Sherry's going to close us out. So,
I'm sorry, I was on double mute.
Okay.
Thank you, Shelley Hughes and Susan Nicholson, for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you to all of our Q&A monitors for all your help with the questions. Thank you all for your participation in our webinar today. Please leave your browser open as an action item list will pop up. Look for your certificate in the mail within a couple of weeks. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and this does conclude our webinar. Thank you.